Hello, welcome to the lecture on Chapter 1. I'm going to break it up into a couple of parts so it's more manageable for you to watch. But Chapter 1, I realize that it's got a lot of information. Some of the vocabulary might be intimidating. The reason I'm having you read the whole thing is that a lot of the material that is covered in this chapter is going to come up again later in the course. And so I feel like it is generally helpful for people to be exposed to the same thing multiple times. So the more you read it, each time it's going to make a little bit more sense, right? So this chapter is your basic introduction to the themes of biology and your introduction to some of the vocabulary that we will be digging into deeper later. So don't stress out now if it doesn't all make sense. So what is biology? This is a cell biology for health occupations class, so I thought it'd be good to talk about what biology is and what cells are. So biology is the study of living things. That includes animals, plants, amoebas, bacteria, all different kinds of living things. And that raises the question, what distinguishes a living thing from a non-living thing? So maybe pause the video, make a list for yourself. What characteristics do living things have that non-living things do not? I'm just going to talk about two characteristics here. One is the idea that living things are made up of cells. Non-living things are not made up of cells. And living things can reproduce on their own, whereas non-living things can't make copies of themselves without some sort of outside help. So if living things are made up of cells, what is a cell? I like to make the analogy that a cell is a bag of stuff, with the membrane on the outside being the bag. So cells are surrounded by a membrane. It's also called a plasma membrane or a lipid bilayer. But the membrane on the outside is made of fat-like molecules mostly. And so there's going to be a liquid inside the cell, a liquid outside the cell, and this fatty membrane prevents stuff outside the cell getting into the cell and vice versa, unless the cell wants that to happen. So the stuff inside of the membrane is called the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm has a lot of water in it. It's also got sugars, salt, protein, other stuff dissolved in there, and it makes kind of like a gel-like substance inside the cell. And cells are divided into two broad categories. One is prokaryotic cells and the other is eukaryotic cells. So, prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. A nucleus is when it's called an organelle. We'll talk about what organelles are in a second. But a nucleus is sort of a double membrane that surrounds the DNA in the eukaryotic cell. So prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus around their DNA. Their DNA just is in the cytoplasm. Whereas eukaryotic cells have the nucleus and then the DNA is inside of that. So it's separated from the cytoplasm at large. Prokaryotic cells evolved first. They're tiny. So the very first cells on Earth didn't have nucleuses. They were tiny little cells, relatively simple. They didn't have any membrane-bound organelles. And again, we'll talk about that in a sec. And prokaryotic cells include bacteria and a group called archaea, which are pretty similar to bacteria. So after a lot of years, eukaryotic cells evolved from prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are larger and more complicated. They have a nucleus. They also have other membrane-bound structures inside of them that do certain jobs. And plants, animals, fungi, and protists all have eukaryotic cells. So your cells are eukaryotic, although you also have a bunch of prokaryotic bacteria in and all over your body. So here's a diagram of eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. You can see that the prokaryotic cell on the right is tiny and simple, and the DNA, that's that purplish part, is just sitting in the middle of the cell. It doesn't have a membrane around it. The eukaryotic cell on the left is big and complicated. The purple is the DNA and bluish purple, and it is enclosed by a membrane. That's why it makes that kind of nice round shape. And then there are a lot of other regions of the cell that are also enclosed by membranes, and those are the brown and the orange and the blue, so the light blue. So that's that. So what is a membrane enclosed organelle? So we said that eukaryotic cells have them, prokaryotic cells don't. A membrane enclosed organelle is a part of the cell that performs a specific function. It has a job of some kind. The membrane on the outside is like the membrane for the whole cell. It's just like a fatty layer that makes a little bag on the outside. Probably the most famous organelle. Sorry if you hear my dog sighing in the background. She's bored by me. The famous example is the mitochondrion, the powerhouse of the cell. And we're going to talk a lot about organelles when we talk about cells later on in the course. So again, back to that analogy of a cell is a bag of stuff. A prokaryotic cell is a bag of stuff. A eukaryotic cell is a bag of bags of stuff. So that, if that helps you distinguish between the two. So one term I'd like to talk about a little bit is organism. An organism is any individual living thing. So this earthworm is an organism, this dandelion is an organism, the F is an amoeba, that's an organism, and the E. coli purple things there are individual organisms. And an organism can be made up of a lot of cells, like an animal or a plant, or it can be made up of one cell, like an amoeba or a bacteria. So that amoeba is an individual, even though it's only made of one cell, so it's an organism. It's a unicellular organism, unicellular, one cell. Whereas the earthworm is a multicellular organism. It has many cells, and if you took out one of those individual cells, that cell would not be an organism because it needs the whole organism to survive. And so we said that the second thing that distinguishes living things from non-living things is that living things can reproduce on their own, whereas non-living things cannot. So what do we mean when we talk about reproduction? For a single-celled organism, that means that the cell grows and then splits in half, basically. So that's how it reproduces. When we're talking about a multicellular organism, maybe it creates a sperm and maybe the male creates sperm and the female creates eggs, and the sperm and the egg fertilize and it creates a chick. So living things can do that, non-living things can't. And for that reason, viruses are generally not considered to be alive. And by generally, I mean that most scientists would agree that viruses don't meet the definitions for living things. They are kind of a weird gray area where they have a lot of similarities with living things, but they are not considered living things. And that is because they need to infect a cell in order to reproduce. So a virus all by itself can't make another virus. The virus needs to find a cell, get into that cell, make the cell copy its genetic material and make all of the proteins, make the cell produce a new virus, and then spit it out into the world. So viruses are not considered to be alive, but they're unique. They're unique among non-living things. And then biology in general is a really broad field. It's a really cool field for this reason, I think, that if you are interested in studying biology, you could study atoms and molecules and just the tiniest things, or you could study the entire Earth and the interactions between the plants and the animals and the atmosphere and everything on the Earth. So biology is a huge field with a lot of diverse disciplines. So if that catches your interest, there are a lot of different ways that you could go. Okay, I'm going to stop this section of the lecture here. I'll start up again on the next video.